Well, welcome to this interview, Mr. Geoff Grandfield. We're going to talk about your silent graphic novel, Grey Waters. I'm Karl Foster, and I'm from the London College of Communication, part of UAL. And this is part of a series of lectures that I do about graphic narratives. Question 1. What are the reasons behind you creating a silent graphic novel?
Okay, well, it feels right. And I'm kind of following instincts. That's something which I've felt an essential thing to do with illustration as a discipline, as a practitioner, and also in teaching. I find there's a feeling that's inside you where you have certain instincts to try something in a certain way. So there's a lot of resonance with the silent form. I find that silent film and graphic novels and film have an interesting correlation. Silent film was primarily a visual storytelling form, which would often have a musical soundtrack, but a lot of the content had to be communicated through the visual. And the notion of a silent novel has this absence of a narrative in it, which when you read, you're looking at basically a form that doesn't have an audio aspect to it. So a graphic novel, in some ways, the experience of a graphic novel is silent, and having silence as part of its component, I feel, has a resonance with certain things. So the storytelling in this case relates to the notion of dream, of recall, and that can be a silent experience. So something where there isn't any actual sound in it. The thing is a visual communication.
You had a previous foray into graphic novels, the treatment for The Fast One by Paul Kane. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, that was something I started after leaving college, actually, graduation, starting to work as a commercial illustrator. I found the fragmentation of commercial jobs and commissions being quite disorientating. It didn't feel like I had a sense of continuity. So around that time, this is the early 90s, I was reading quite a lot of crime fiction. And I picked up this one book, Paul Kane's Fast One. And it has the most extraordinary in-person, in the moment, present tense way of writing, quite unusual. And it basically describes not really what the main protagonist is thinking, but what they are doing. So it's almost a kind of descriptive novel of the actions of somebody. And I felt so compelled by this approach that I thought, wow, well, it's virtually an instruction on how to visualize something. So I started to draw it. And it became more and more of a project. I started to draw it in more and more detail. I wasn't sure how to kind of lay it out in terms of a page or what it would look like. I approached the publisher, who's just one guy who I think's still going, No Exit Press, based in Hertfordshire, and let the person know that I was actually doing this. And they got very excited and said, wow, well, we could put it out as a graphic novel. I didn't really intend it as a graphic novel. It's more of a kind of visual treatment of a novel. And I agreed. And first of all, I was going to do a few pages for their Christmas omnibus. And then they liked that so much, they said, well, why not do the whole thing? So I spent about 6 months, 8 months drawing every day, about 16 hours a day, and just making, I think, around 1,500 pictures. And it kind of was frustrating. It was a bit crazy. I used to go and buy a pint of milk just so I could actually talk to somebody, because I was basically just not having any conversation with anybody. I was just working. So it was brilliant to do, immersion like that and everything. I was getting a few commissions as well. But effectively it came out, it didn't quite come out as I wanted it to. They made various decisions about the formatting. They felt it should be portrait, not landscape. I designed it landscape. Had to cut the whole thing up and rearrange it. Then there was a kind of text which was inserted, which was kind of just photocopied text from the actual book. Not all of that was resolved that well. So although it got into print, which I'm pleased it did, quite early foray into graphic novel form, it certainly wasn't the way I really wanted to see that form explored. And it's something which actually I'm working on a digital kind of recut of the whole thing at the moment. So in a new form. So it's going to be much more how I envisaged the thing originally. So it got out there. It was good. Got some good feedback and things like that. And now, 30 years later, I'm doing my follow-up.
Thank you. This is question 2. Where does the title Grey Waters come from?
Okay, well, titling is an interesting form. Of course, it's something which is a kind of positioning for what the experience the reader audience may have. So I felt it was important to get something concise and something that was effectively memorable, something which might be a slight contradiction or have something in it which was resonant. It just so happens this novel is based on a real person and real events in history which took place. And their name does phonetically sound like Grey Waters. So I've changed the spelling of it in order to keep a kind of reference, but it also refers to a number of other things, such as memory, the notion of a kind of immersion in a mental state where you're not quite aware of what's going on, such as a coma. So people talk about the brain as grey matter, and I thought the combination of water and immersion in water, so Grey Waters, felt like it covered a lot of bases, including the protagonist, and it was concise enough to be hopefully a memorable title.
Thank you. This is question 3. Do you consider yourself a writer or an artist?
Well, I feel writing in pictures is a form that doesn't have particularly clear description as an activity. So there isn't perhaps a single, you've got a screenwriter who's a writer who works in cinema, but there doesn't seem to be a single phrase for the image writer. So I think effectively, I think it's basically something where the word illustration, if it can be teased away from its popular association with children's book or greetings cards or the covers of a magazine or a book, effectively illustration has got this deeper meaning of a translation of some kind, an illumination of a version of something, an interpretation. It's got this kind of rich history, which is sometimes a bit hard to recognize. So I like the word illustration, actually, so I call myself an illustrator.
Okay, thank you. Question 4. What are your thoughts on image as literature?
Well, it's an interesting question. Thank you. I mean, I think the notion of reading pictures is interesting. Reading words tends to have a linear structure, which is obviously can be challenged and played with and explored. But what I love about pictures is the fact, the way that science actually doesn't trust pictures very much, is that there isn't one reading. It can be read on a multi-layered and multiple axes. So the image can be read as a totality, it can be read in details, it can be read in non-linear forms, cellular forms, reading things at the same time. You might read, i.e. perceive colour, shape, texture, all at the same time. So you have a multi-sensory input, which words, whilst they do have more than just the meaning of the word, of course they've got a visual form as well, it just feels a much richer form. So I feel that image as literature offers a very exciting, probably underexplored set of potentials for where we're going as a sort of communication form, as a culture or cultures.
Thank you. So question 5 is about the truth. So at the moment we're kind of in a situation where the truth is becoming something that's under question. So Why do you think that truth has become such a mercurial thing during the 21st century?
Well, it's a complicated question. Of course, I've only got my own take on these things, but I think the persistence of centuries-old monolithic cultures, there's been very dominant forms which have had their economic power based in authority of power, violence, economic. Some of these things have been restructured through the rise of a digital technology, which offers perhaps a certain amount of democratizing of knowledge and of access. These things are always going to be contested and are always going to be fought over. And in some ways, truth is highly subjective. It's something which is very relevant to life experience, lived experience, and privilege as well. So it's not something which exists in one form, but there's certainly been dominant narratives through history which tell us there was a truth or is a truth. I find the approach that artists need to take in their lives of actually understanding themselves as a truth-forming way of understanding the world.
Okay, thank you. So question 6 builds upon this. Who is responsible for telling the truth?
Well, again, I mean, when it comes to responsibility, I mean, we all purport to want to know what the truth is. I mean, I think there's another word which is incredibly useful for a creative practitioner, and that is authenticity. It's like, what is actually real to you as a person? So what is your truth? I do think it's subjective. So I don't think it's a case that, unlike some areas in certainly American politics and perhaps in Russian politics, there's people who want to tell you what truth is. I do think people should be given tools for them to be able to understand their own truth and their own sense of authenticity. So it's something where the artist is probably quite well equipped to not perhaps necessarily get an answer, but certainly have a pretty good go at looking for something and trying to find something. It may take a whole lifetime, but it's something which is a much more positive, I believe it's a much more positive way of approaching and living a life, is to ask questions of yourself and therefore have something that's actually, you're moving towards a form of authenticity as opposed to accepting someone else's truth. Accepting someone else's truth, okay, short-term gain might make you feel more comfortable and sleep well at night. Maybe not. It's obviously down to the individual. Some people go through life never questioning and have perfectly happy lives. That's fine. But I've never really been in that position. So for me, I've always been in a position where it's been important to me to try and understand more about myself and about my art. And I use my art to kind of effectively pursue that question.
Okay, thank you. This is question 7 now. So, building on this, how do you keep your ideas fresh when so much of our visual world is controlled by large corporations and power bases?
Yeah, well, again, really good question. I mean, again, they're very, very subjective personal response to this. I would say, I mean, in terms of fresh, I mean, I assume that means a certain amount of kind of newness or a certain amount of originality. There's plenty of people who theorize and say that there's no such thing as originality. But I do think, we've got the capacity to be able to, if not be original, certainly bring the less likely and the less well recognized forms together. That's unlikely to be offered to you. You get novelty in a dominant system, but we have a dominant system which it functions for some people of commodity exchange, consumer capitalism. But as we know, there's finite resources in the world, and we're heading for a kind of a major showdown about how human beings live their life. It's not the case that we can just have open consumption without ever thinking about the consequences of it. We've all got responsibility to next future generations. So I think what's essential is that what a corporate agenda of like selling more and making a bigger profit, that there is a way of pushing back and challenging that and not feeling that you have become a revolutionary Marxist to kind of question the system needs to be modified, it needs to be challenged, it needs to be given some form of alternative which is about saving the planet rather than continuing to destroy and consume the planet. So there's got to be an alternative, and I think it's for future generations to kind of judge us about how much we do to actually try and achieve that. I think, art is a way of doing that. We need new forms, new imagination to solve these things. There's a strong argument to say that linguistics and invented human social constructions of languages are actually restricting the way we can think about the world. And I love the idea that the visual, misunderstood and often distrusted by the scientific community, may be the answer to actually opening up a new understanding about the world, about our relationship to the world, and about one another. So instead of this, what seems to be an impenetrable Gordian knot of pressures and problems, there are ways out of it. There are ways to actually rethink societies. I feel like, it's a great question, but I've come quite a long way from my silent graphic novel. But in my silent graphic novel, I feel like I'm hopefully offering a contribution to the validation of a different form, a form that's less recognised. I remember talking to a well-known publisher of graphic novels, and even before they saw what my proposal was for this, they said, "No, please don't tell me it's a graphic novel with only words." And I said, "Well, brace yourself," because traditionally, from a consumer capitalist point of view, graphic novels without words, they don't sell as well as graphic novels with words. Now, I'm not making something as a commercial enterprise to make a lot of money and have a Hollywood film of it. I really want to make something which helps us to question and look at the form. And if I can offer validation of a form and say, it's okay to make books which have no words in. It's okay to have narratives that are actually non-linear. They don't always go forward. You can go back. In the book, I've used a lot of reoccurring motifs and shapes on the notion that you will kind of come to a page or come to a frame and say, I've already seen that. That's the whole point. It's about memory and loss of memory and not being able to rely on your memory and being able to say, okay, this is new to me. So many, people will experience things like deja vu or the Groundhog Day of like, I've been there before. I'm going through the same thing again. So this story plays on our visual memory of how image keeps cropping up. Certain forms, you don't know why they're significant, but they start to take on a significance.
Thank you. So this is now going to be question 8. I'm skipping a question. Question 8. So in a world filled with electronic media, do you think the traditional book has had its day? Or we always need books?
Well, I think we always need communication tools, and I see a book as a communication tool, so a way of being able to engage an audience. It doesn't really matter whether it's digital, physical, a play, performance, whether it's music, whether it's audio, combinations of all these media, an object, an artifact, a spatial experience where you go into somewhere and you come back out the other side, or so many different possibilities. I think what's essential for the book form is its low-tech accessibility and its reproduction costs tend to be lower than something like, accessing a VR headset or something like that. So I like its immediacy. I like its capability of being able to reach a broader audience. I like the artifact coming out into the world, obviously using responsibly sourced materials, but effectively actually having an artifact means that the significance can enter a form a little bit like you don't know who's going to pick it up. You don't know who's going to see it. If it's the more controlled the technological route to access something is, perhaps the more you limit the audience possibility. If you put something out into print, it gets bought, it gets sold, it might get remaindered, it might get put onto a shelf somewhere, it might go into a backpack and be taken to another part of the world. It can go out there in the world a bit like a message in a bottle. It can kind of float around, and you never hopefully it will have resonance for people who have never sought it, they've never looked for it, they never thought anything of it. They just pick it up one day, they see something, and it has this resonance. What I love about the printed form, it's got that probably still over many other forms. I mean, you might spend all afternoon doom scrolling through Instagram or something, but this is a kind of immersive experience that offers something different, and perhaps, that difference also helps some of the things we mentioned earlier in this interview about new forms of activating and imagining things. So who knows?
Okay, thank you. Final question. What are you working on now next?
Well, I've been a PhD supervisor as part of my teaching remit at Kingston. And that's been an amazing process for me. I wouldn't necessarily link a doctoral research inquiry with illustration, but why not? And in some ways, as I've said about validating the silent novel, the notion of validating research for illustrators to be, why not? Effectively, the illustrator, as they go around the world looking, inquiring, making image, they are perhaps looking and inquiring in a different way from other people who go around the world, and they're quite happy to call themselves researchers and quite happy to take on a PhD inquiry for 4 or 5 years and publish it in words. And for us to have a broader academy of knowledge as human beings, why not try and contribute something which is visual to that canon of scientific and qualitative knowledge? I think the illustrator has a lot to offer, which is not really acknowledged. So I've had 2 completions so far, which I'm very proud of as a supervisor for a PhD. I'm embarking on my own research inquiry alongside supervising current students as well. And it gives a framework, so it gives a structure. It's often difficult as a visual practitioner to find structure. One classic way of structuring the visual is to map something, create some form of diagram. So I've been effectively mapping out ideas. I use words, but I will also use images. And my idea is to try and explore something which is actually very central to me, which is about identity and using intuitive instinct. So as an adopted person, I've been exploring the question of what does the pre-verbal world look like, which is probably a subject for another interview, but that's where I am at the moment.
Thank you very much. So I've come up to the end of the questions, but I'm going to add one extra question, and that's essentially to say, is there anything about Grey Waters that you haven't covered already that you'd like the audience to know about?
Well, one thing which I would really like to say about it is that it's a kind of proposition, and I mean this as a maker. Sometimes when an image goes out into the world, you might think that's exactly how somebody intended it, but I do find it quite fascinating, the idea of creating a prompt for somebody to kind of respond to it. So it's not, I don't see it as a single one-way road. It's something. So I guess where I'm going with this, it'll be very interesting to hear responses from people in terms of what their thoughts might be about this experience. I don't see the book as a fixed thing. I like the idea of something which has a two-way or a kind of resonance. The intention is to, I guess I can put that better in the sense that what I'm trying to do is suggest something, and that suggestion is open to interpretation rather than it being a fixed form and it only has one reading. So that multiple reading, as I've tried to make inherent within the actual visual form, I'm also saying that about the whole enterprise, that it's a proposition rather than a statement.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time, Geoff, and we're looking forward to see how Grey Waters evolves in the next few months.
Great.
Thanks a lot.
No, thank you, Karl, very much for the opportunity.